Detective Miles Corbin's office was less a workspace and more a mausoleum for forgotten stories. The air thick with the scent of aging paper and the bitter ghost of yesterday's coffee hung heavy under the tired hum of fluorescent lights. At 59, Corbin wore the city's grim history in the deep lines etched around his eyes and the permanent slump of his shoulders. He was a man built of methodical habits and quiet disillusionment, counting down the last 187 days until retirement. His desk was an island of meticulous order in a sea of cold case files, each stacked box a monument to a life interrupted, a question left to fester in the damp Oregon air. A single faded photograph of a smiling woman and a young boy stood sentinel by his phone, a daily reminder of a different kind of cold case, one he had long since stopped investigating. The town of Havenwood, Oregon, existed in a perpetual state of twilight, huddled beneath the oppressive canopy of the ancient forests that surrounded it. Fog was the town's most constant resident, rolling in from the coast to weave through the towering Douglas firs and cloak the quiet streets in a soft, gray shroud. For 31 years, this fog had felt like a physical manifestation of the community's collective memory of St. Jude's Asylum. The story of its vanishing on Halloween night in 1977 was no longer news. It was folklore, a chilling tale told to frightened children, and a somber piece of local identity. The empty foundation, miles out of town, was a scar on the landscape, a place where reality had seemingly frayed at the edges and left an unnerving, permanent void. Corbin's daily ritual was a study in deliberate motion, a slow march toward the inevitable end of his career. He'd arrive at 7 a.m., pour the same lukewarm coffee, and methodically work his way through paperwork that rarely led anywhere new. The Havenwood vanishing file landed on his desk that Tuesday morning with a thud that felt both literal and symbolic. It was a parting gift from his captain, a notoriously impossible case meant to occupy his final months. The cardboard box was soft with age, its label, St. Jude's, 10/31/77, faded to a barely legible whisper. Corbin ran a weary hand over his face, seeing it not as a challenge, but as a final cruel joke, a puzzle with no pieces, a story with no words left to read. Inside the box, the initial 1927 investigation files painted a stark portrait of utter bewilderment. He spread the glossy black-and-white photographs across his desk, each a window into an impossible scene. There was the concrete foundation, perfectly and unnervingly clean, as if the massive hospital had been surgically excised from the earth. He saw the faces of the first responding officers, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and a primal fear that transcended the grainy film. News clippings screamed with sensational headlines, but the reports themselves were thin, filled with speculation about seismic events, secret military experiments, or even extraterrestrial intervention. The investigation had died within weeks, not from a lack of effort, but from a complete and total absence of evidence. There was nothing to find. Buried beneath the official reports was a small, separate folder containing letters from the families of the missing. Most were decades old, but one series of correspondences stood out. A single persistent inquiry arrived every October 31st, year after year, written in the same elegant, determined cursive. The letters were from a Sarah Vance, daughter of Eleanor Vance, a nurse who had been on duty that night. Each one was a polite, heartbreaking plea for any information, no matter how small. Corbin paused, tracing the name with his finger. For a moment, the abstract legend of 81 vanished people coalesced into the tangible grief of a single daughter, a grief that had spanned more than 3 decades without the solace of a grave to visit or a story to tell. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across his office, Corbin methodically repacked the box. The rhythm of his career was pulling him toward the door, toward another quiet, solitary evening. He placed the Havenwood file on the corner of his desk, a silent, imposing guest in his sanctuary of endings. Outside, a light drizzle began to patter against the window pane, the sound a soft, melancholic drumbeat marking the passage of time. The office was quiet, filled only with the hum of the lights and the ghosts of unresolved histories. He reached for his coat, the sense of routine a comforting blanket, completely unaware that the normality he clung to was about to be irrevocably, violently shattered by a single incoming phone call. The shrill ring of the telephone sliced through the quiet hum of Corbin's office, an unwelcome intrusion on his methodical descent into evening. It was the sheriff's department from a neighboring county, the deputy's voice crackling with an excitement Corbin hadn't felt in years. A logging crew clearing a tract of land bordering the old St. Jude's property had hit something metal deep in the earth, where there should have been only rock and root. Corbin's initial reaction was a familiar wave of weary resignation. Another false alarm, another local myth dredged up from the mud. Still, protocol was protocol. He sighed, the sound lost in the static of the line, and agreed to meet them, grabbing his coat with the grim sense that his quiet evening had just been sacrificed for another dead end. Upon arriving, the scene was bathed in the harsh artificial glare of portable floodlights, casting long dancing shadows of the towering pines. The air was cold and sharp, thick with the scent of freshly churned soil, damp leaves, and diesel fuel from the idling machinery. Deputies stood in a loose circle around a deep pit, their breath pluming in the frigid air. There, half excavated from the dark, clay-rich earth, was the source of the commotion. A large, featureless chest, its surface a dark, oxidized metal that seemed to absorb the light. It was old, clearly man-made, and profoundly out of place. Corbin felt the first faint prickle of something other than annoyance, a nascent curiosity that felt alien after so many years of practiced indifference. On Halloween night, 1977, the interior of St. Jude's Asylum was not a place of terror, but of an unnerving, orchestrated tranquility. Nurse Eleanor Vance moved with a practiced grace down the main corridor, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished linoleum. A low, resonant hum, more a feeling in the bones than a sound in the ears, permeated the entire structure. In their rooms, the 57 patients were not screaming or rattling their doors. They were in a deep, peaceful slumber, a state induced not by force, but by a carefully administered cocktail of sedatives and what Dr. Finch had called sonic therapy. The air tasted of ozone and antiseptic, a sterile calm before a storm of impossible proportions. Eleanor paused before a window overlooking the dense, fog-shrouded forest, her reflection a pale ghost in the glass. From her pocket she pulled a small, dog-eared photograph of a smiling, gap-toothed little girl, her daughter, Sarah. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, her resolve wavered. A profound maternal ache gripped her heart, a silent scream of doubt against the fanatical certainty that had consumed the hospital. Just then Dr. Alistair Finch's voice, impossibly calm and paternal, echoed softly from a hidden speaker. "Doubt is the last symptom of the sickness we are about to cure," he said, as if sensing her hesitation. "Have faith, Eleanor. We are leaving the pain behind." With a trembling hand she tucked the photo away, her face hardening into a mask of conviction. Back in 2008, a heavy-duty winch groaned under the strain as it slowly hoisted the chest from its earthen tomb. The box was heavier than anyone anticipated, its sheer mass suggesting contents of immense density and importance. The deputies and loggers watched in hushed silence, their earlier excitement replaced by a palpable sense of awe and apprehension. What could have been buried here with such deliberate effort so close to the site of the great vanishing? Corbin stood apart, his gaze fixed on the chest, as it swung gently in the cold night air. The cynicism that had been his armor for decades was beginning to crack. eroded by the sheer undeniable reality of the object before him. This was not folklore. This was evidence. Hours later, in the sterile environment of the forensics lab, the chest was finally pried open. The shriek of metal protesting its violation after 31 years of silence filled the room. Everyone leaned in, expecting the grim discovery of human remains or a cache of weapons. Instead, the interior revealed a scene of meticulous organization. Neatly arranged and cushioned in now decaying foam were dozens of audio cassette tapes, each carefully labeled in precise, elegant script. Alongside them were thick leather-bound ledgers and a series of schematics rolled into tight scrolls and sealed with wax. The air hung with anticlimax and a new, deeper mystery. This wasn't the tomb of a victim, but the archive of a conspiracy. In the sub-basement of St. Jude's in 1977, the source of the pervasive hum was revealed. The staff stood in a semicircle around a bizarre, intricate machine of gleaming copper coils, spinning gyroscopes, and massive, tuning fork-like structures that pulsed with a soft internal blue light. This was Dr. Finch's resonance cascade. He stood before them, not as a doctor, but as a prophet on the verge of delivering his flock to a promised land. "Tonight," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "we shed the crude vessel of this reality. We are not escaping. We are not dying. We are ascending. We are going home." His eyes shone with a zealous fire that was reflected in the faces of his loyal staff. The vibration intensified, moving from a subtle hum to a deep, powerful thrum that shook the very foundations of the hospital. The lights overhead flickered and buzzed erratically as dust and loose plaster rained down from the ceiling. Outside, the fog clinging to the building began to behave unnaturally, swirling into a vortex and glowing with a faint, sickly green light, as if the asylum itself were generating its own private storm. The boundary between the world inside and the world outside was becoming porous, indistinct. Inside the sub-basement, the staff linked hands, their faces upturned, a choir of true believers chanting a low, melodic mantra as the machine reached the apex of its power. A wave of profound disorientation washed over the staff. The concrete walls of the sub-basement began to shimmer, their solid forms wavering like a heat haze on asphalt. For a terrifying, sublime moment, they became translucent, offering a ghostly superimposed view of the ancient, moss-covered trees of the forest that surrounded them. It was as if the hospital and the woods were attempting to occupy the same space at the same time, the laws of physics fraying at the seams. Eleanor Vance's eyes shot open, her chant catching in her throat. Her face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, the primal terror of the unknown warring with the ecstatic awe of witnessing a miracle. Late that night, alone in his office, the city lights a distant, indifferent glimmer, Corbin slid the first cassette into an old player. The tape was labeled Dr. A. Finch, Preparatory Log 01. He pressed the play button, and the silence was broken by the soft hiss of magnetic tape. Then a voice emerged from the past, a voice that was calm, cultured, and imbued with an unnerving degree of confidence. "Log Entry 1, it began. "The final phase of the project is upon us. The vessel has been calibrated, and the crew is prepared for its voyage. All biological subjects have been sedated and are ready for transit. The material world has proven to be an unsustainable environment. We have engineered a solution." Corbin leaned back in his chair, the blood draining from his face. Finch's calm, clinical narration played on, a chilling counterpoint to the bizarre document spread across his desk. He looked at the schematics, now identified by a consultant as a theoretical reality phasing engine. He scanned the employee logs, which detailed years of attunement sessions, resonant frequency drills, and group meditations designed to unify their collective consciousness. The strange conduct wasn't a prelude to a crime. It was the meticulous preparation for a departure. A cold, heavy certainty settled in Corbin's gut. These 81 people hadn't been taken. They had left. Willingly. The final moment in 1977 was not one of sound and fury. The building-shaking vibration coalesced into a single, impossibly pure harmonic note that seemed to absorb all other sound, creating a pocket of profound silence. A blinding white light erupted from the sub-basement, engulfing the entire asylum in its sterile, absolute brilliance. From the perspective of the silent forest, the massive structure of St. Jude's did not explode or collapse. It simply dissolved. The light and the building it contained contracted in an instant to a single searing point of energy, which then winked out of existence. Where a hospital had stood moments before, there was now only the swirling fog, the whispering pines, and a perfectly clean, empty foundation under the cold Halloween moon. For 31 years, the name Sarah Vance had become synonymous with a quiet, unyielding grief that had settled into the very marrow of her bones. Now in her early 60s, she moved through her small, meticulously kept house with a lifetime of practice in navigating around the ghost of her mother, Eleanor. Every October 31st, she would perform the same solemn ritual. She would sit at the antique writing desk that had once been her mother's, pull out a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, and compose another letter to the Havenwood Police Department. The act was no longer fueled by hope, but by a stubborn, sacred duty. Her home was a shrine, each photograph and inherited teacup, a relic from a life that hadn't ended, but had simply ceased to be. In the immediate aftermath of the vanishing, a younger Sarah had been a whirlwind of frantic energy. She was a fixture at the chaotic town hall meetings, her voice raw from shouting questions at overwhelmed officials who had no answers. She clung to the television, absorbing every sensational news report, each wild theory of seismic events or secret government tests, with a desperate hope that one might hold a kernel of truth. But as weeks bled into months, that frantic energy slowly curdled into a cold, bewildering despair. The world had offered an impossible event, and then, cruelly, had offered nothing else. The silence that followed the initial chaos was a heavier blow than the event itself, leaving a void where a future was supposed to be. The town of Havenwood aged alongside Sarah, its collective psyche scarred by the wound that never closed. The disappearance of St. Jude's became its defining myth, a grim folktale woven into the fabric of the community. The empty foundation, swallowed by the encroaching forest, became a place of morbid pilgrimage for teenagers and paranormal enthusiasts, its story whispered around campfires. The perpetual fog that rolled through the pines felt less like a weather pattern and more like a physical manifestation of the town's unresolved trauma. For 3 decades, Havenwood existed, not in the present, but in the long gray shadow of a single autumn night in 1977, a community held captive by an absence. Sarah often found herself lost in the semantics of the tragedy. Her mother hadn't died, she had vanished. The word itself was a cruel abstraction, a term that offered no ceremony, no closure, no final resting place. It suggested a state of perpetual limbo, an existence between worlds, and it was in that same limbo that Sarah had been forced to live. She would sift through memories of Eleanor, a pragmatic, no-nonsense woman who grounded her medical knowledge in tangible science. The idea that this same woman could be swept up in some esoteric, reality-bending scheme was a paradox that had tormented Sarah's mind for years, a constant, irreconcilable clash between the mother she knew and the bizarre mystery that had claimed her. Her personal investigation became the central project of her life, a lonely crusade waged in the dusty archives of public libraries and the echoing halls of county records offices. She spent countless hours hunched over microfiche readers, her eyes burning as she scanned faded newspapers for any forgotten detail. She made awkward, painful phone calls to the distant relatives of other St. Jude's staff, only to be met with weary resignation or the polite disinterest of people who had long ago made their peace with the unknown. Each dead end was a fresh cut, yet she persisted, her quest for answers slowly supplanting her own identity until she was no longer just Sarah, but the daughter of the vanished nurse. Sometimes a memory would surface with such startling clarity that it felt like a physical blow. She would be in her kitchen and suddenly smell the phantom scent of cinnamon and vanilla, and she would be a child again, watching Eleanor's strong, capable hands kneading dough for cookies. She could feel the warmth of the room, hear her mother's soft humming, see the dusting of flour on her cheek. These sensory ghosts were the cruelest, for they reminded her not of the grand, unsolvable mystery, but of the simple, profound, and tangible loss of a mother's presence. The memories were a testament to what was real, a painful anchor in an ocean of impossible speculation. As Detective Corbin sat in his dimly lit office in 2008, the calm, unnerving voice of Dr. Alistair Finch whispering from the cassette player, his own ghost watched him from the corner of his desk. The faded photograph of his wife and son, their smiles frozen in a perfect sunlit moment before the screech of tires and the shattering of glass, was his own personal cold case. Theirs was not a mystery, it was a brutal, straightforward tragedy. Yet the finality of their deaths had carved a void in him that mirrored the one Sarah Vance had lived with for 31 years. He understood, in a way he couldn't yet articulate, the profound weight of an absence that defines every day that follows. Sarah had not been entirely alone in her vigil, at least not at first. In the early 1980s, a support group had formed, a small, sad gathering of the families left behind. They met in a church basement, sharing coffee, tears, and increasingly wild theories. For a time, their shared grief was a fragile comfort, a confirmation that they were not going mad. But time is a relentless force of erosion. As the years stretched on, members passed away, moved to other towns, or simply surrendered to the crushing weight of not knowing. The group dwindled until only a few remained, and eventually only Sarah was left, the last keeper of a flame that had all but flickered out. Once a year, on Halloween, she would make the drive out to the old St. Jude's property. The pilgrimage was a somber, solitary affair. She would park her car on the overgrown access road and walk the final half-mile through the silent, imposing pines. The site itself was an eerie tableau, a perfect concrete rectangle, now cracked and carpeted with moss, asserting its unnatural geometry against the chaos of the wilderness. She would stand at the edge of the foundation, the air still and heavy, and listen. She searched for some echo, some residual energy, some sign that she was standing on hallowed ground, but all she ever found was the mournful whisper of the wind. The years had transformed the nature of her grief. The fiery, desperate anger of her 20s had long since cooled, weathered by decades of unanswered questions, into something more resilient, more profound. Her search was no longer a frantic scramble for a solution, but a solemn, meditative act of remembrance. It was her way of ensuring that the 81 people who disappeared that night, especially her mother, were not relegated to the status of a ghost story. She had become their historian, the living archivist of their stolen lives, bearing witness to a past that the rest of the world was content to forget. Her perseverance was no longer about finding answers, but about honoring the question. In his office, Corbin pressed stop on the recorder, the silence rushing back in. He had just heard Dr. Finch praise Nurse Eleanor Vance for her unwavering conviction in the face of the final transition. The words were chillingly deliberate. He picked up the thick file of letters from Sarah, feeling the physical weight of her 31 years of inquiries. He saw the elegant, determined cursive, a testament to a daughter's undying love. and contrasted it with the calm, fanatical voice on the tape describing a mother who had, by all accounts, willingly chosen her fate. The tragic, heartbreaking irony settled in his gut like a stone, reframing the mystery from one of abduction to one of profound betrayal. Regret was a constant, unwelcome companion to her grief. Sarah would often find her mind drifting back to a stupid, trivial argument she'd had with her mother a week before the vanishing. It was a typical teenage squabble over a curfew, filled with slammed doors and words she hadn't meant. She couldn't even remember the details, but she remembered the feeling of her mother's disappointment. Those final harsh interactions had become magnified over the years, replaying in her mind as a litany of her own failings. The universal ache of wishing for one last conversation, one more chance to say sorry, to say, "I love you," was amplified into an unbearable torment by the eternal silence that followed. Over the decades, Havenwood's relationship with its own tragedy had soured into a strange, commercialized caricature. The vanished hospital site became a dot on obscure tourist maps, drawing a trickle of paranormal investigators and curiosity seekers. A downtown gift shop sold T-shirts with a ghostly outline of the asylum and the date of its disappearance. For Sarah, this trivialization of her pain was a quiet, constant agony. To see her mother's memory, and the memory of the 80 others, reduced to a kitschy souvenir, was a reminder that her profound personal loss had been consumed by the public imagination and turned into a piece of cheap, spooky folklore, its human heart completely stripped away. As the fog thickened outside her window, on the evening of October 31st, 2008, Sarah Vance completed her annual rituals. The letter was mailed. The pilgrimage to the foundation was made. A deep, familiar exhaustion settled over her, the immense psychic weight of 11,315 days of not knowing. She allowed a flicker of despair, the weary certainty that this year would be no different from the last, that her vigil was a fool's errand. She was completely unaware that, miles away, in a sterile police office, a jaded detective had just unearthed the first words of an answer, and that her long, lonely wait was finally, irrevocably, coming to an end. The hours bled together, marked only by the slow rotation of spools in the cassette player. Detective Corbin was adrift in the sea of Dr. Finch's calm, hypnotic voice, a voice that spoke of quantum mechanics and spiritual purity with the same detached authority. The logs were a litany of meticulous preparations, from calibrating harmonic frequencies to dietary regimens designed to purify the vessel. It was the mundane, procedural nature of the plan that was most unsettling. Corbin felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, as if the office walls were closing in, saturated with the unwavering logical madness of a man who had convinced 80 others to follow him into the silent, starless void of his own grand theory. The air was stale, thick with the ghosts of spoken words from a lost world. He was about to call it a night, his mind numb from the relentless stream of esoteric jargon, when his fingers brushed against a cassette at the bottom of the box. Unlike the others, which were uniformly labeled Dr. A. Finch, this one bore a different inscription, written in a more delicate, hurried hand. E. Vance, personal log. The name struck him with the force of a physical blow. Eleanor Vance, Sarah's mother. He stared at the tape, the plastic casing feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. This wasn't another sermon from the prophet. This was a voice from the heart of the flock, a personal testament from the very woman whose absence had fueled a daughter's 31-year vigil. A sudden, sharp jolt of adrenaline cut through his exhaustion. With a trembling hand, Corbin ejected Finch's tape and inserted the new one. The click of the player's door closing echoed like a gunshot in the silent office. He pressed play, and after a moment of agonizingly loud hiss, a woman's voice filled the room. It was nothing like Finch's. Where the doctor's was a smooth, resonant baritone, this voice was softer, laced with a weary warmth, and an unmistakable undercurrent of suppressed emotion. "If anyone ever finds this," she began, her words a fragile whisper against the static, "please find my Sarah. Tell her I love her more than any idea, more than any promise of a better world. Tell her that her face is the last thing I will see when I close my eyes." Corbin leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, completely captivated. This was not the confession of a true believer. It was a mother's heartbreaking farewell, a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of impossibility. Eleanor's voice painted a vivid, loving portrait of her daughter, her gap-toothed smile as a child, her fierce independence as a teenager, the way she would hum off-key while doing her homework. Each detail was a tiny, sharp pinprick to Corbin's own walled-off grief. He saw the faded photo of his own son on his desk and felt a profound, crushing connection to the woman on the tape. He wasn't just listening to a clue anymore. He was bearing witness to a soul's final agonizing conflict. Then the tone of the recording shifted. The warmth receded, replaced by a tremor of fear and doubt. "Alistair, Dr. Finch." "He is a brilliant man," Eleanor stammered, as if trying to convince herself. "He speaks of a world without pain, without loss, a place of pure harmony. It is the most beautiful lie I have ever heard." The heresy in that single word, lie, hung in the air, a stark refutation of everything Finch preached. "But a world without my Sarah? How can that be paradise? He says our attachments are anchors, that we must cut the ropes to ascend. But my love for her isn't a rope. It's the only thing that feels real anymore." The discovery was seismic. It shattered the narrative of a unified, fanatical staff marching in lockstep toward a shared destiny. At least one of them, a mother, was torn, her faith poisoned by the profound, instinctual love for her child. Corbin felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a cold case about a vanished building. It was a human drama of manipulation, love, and sacrifice. Eleanor Vance wasn't just a name on a list of the missing. She was a woman trapped between a charismatic leader's promise of eternity and the tangible, undeniable reality of the daughter she was about to abandon. The mystery suddenly had a hero, however tragic. Eleanor's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, the microphone picking up the sound of her glancing nervously over her shoulder. "There are things happening that the others don't see, or don't want to see," she confided to the tape. "The sedatives for the patients, some of them fought it, they knew. They weren't chronically ill, Miles, not all of them. Some were just inconvenient. Dr. Finch called their resistance a final, violent symptom of the world's sickness. He said their fear was a contagion we had to inoculate ourselves against." The utopian dream was rotting from the inside out, revealing a core of chillingly pragmatic cruelty that Finch's logs had so carefully omitted. A cold dread seeped into Corbin's bones. This was no longer a story of a peaceful, collective departure. The presence of resistance, of inconvenient patients being forcibly sedated, introduced the grim specter of crimes committed in the asylum's final hours: false imprisonment, assault, maybe worse. Finch's grand experiment wasn't just an act of mass delusion, it was a meticulously orchestrated kidnapping of 57 souls, some of whom may have been taken against their will, their final moments filled not with serene acceptance, but with terror and confusion. The clean, surgical vanishing now felt dirty, tainted by a darkness that had been deliberately hidden from the archive. He was no longer just investigating a disappearance, he was investigating a crime scene. "I have to believe he's right," Eleanor's voice trembled, a desperate, failing plea. "I have to believe this isn't the end. But just in case this beautiful new world is just a beautiful dream, I left something behind for Sarah." Corbin's breath caught in his throat. "Alistair thinks I destroyed all personal effects, but I couldn't part with it. The foundation, the northeast corner. There's a loose block in the maintenance access tunnel behind the water pump. It's inside. My Sarah will know what it means. It's my fail-safe, my proof that I was real, that we were real. The clue, a tangible breadcrumb left in the ruins of the past, was a jolt of pure, unadulterated hope. The tape continued for another 10 seconds, filled only with the sound of Eleanor's ragged breathing and a single, choked sob. Then a new sound emerged, the soft creak of a door opening. A calm, familiar voice, impossibly close, broke the silence. "Eleanor, it is time. The resonance is peaking. Are you ready to leave the pain behind?" It was Dr. Finch. A sharp click followed as the recorder was hastily shut off, plunging the room back into a profound, suffocating silence. The interruption was more terrifying than any confession, a chilling, unwritten final scene that left Corbin's imagination racing with horrible possibilities. Was she discovered? Or did she simply stand up and join her prophet? For a long time, Corbin didn't move. He sat motionless in his worn leather chair, the hiss of the run-out tape, the only sound in the universe. The voice of a mother torn from her child, the revelation of a hidden darkness, the promise of a final message, it all swirled in his mind, a vortex of grief and hope. He looked at the stack of letters on his desk, the 31 years of Sarah Vance's unanswered questions, written in her elegant, determined cursive. He now held the first real answer she had ever had, an answer that was both a validation of her mother's love and a confirmation of her ultimate betrayal. The weight of that knowledge was immense. He slowly reached for the telephone, its black plastic cool and solid beneath his hand. Every instinct he'd honed over a 30-year career screamed at him to wait, to verify, to follow procedure. But this was no longer about procedure. This was about a daughter who had waited more than half her life for a sign, and a mother who had left one buried in the cold, hard earth. He knew, with a certainty that transcended evidence and logic, that he could not let Sarah Vance spend another night believing her mother had simply forgotten her. The discovery of the tape had changed everything, not just for the case, but for him. He was no longer just closing a file. He was about to deliver a ghost. The phone call to Sarah Vance was the single greatest breach of protocol in Miles Corbin's 33-year career. As the phone rang on the other end, each tone felt like a hammer blow against the rigid discipline that had defined his life. He was a man who followed leads, not gut feelings, a man who delivered verified facts, not raw, uncorroborated audio from a 3-decade-old tape. When a hesitant, weary female voice answered, he found his own voice catching in his throat. He introduced himself, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He didn't tell her what he'd found, not exactly. He simply said there had been a significant development in her mother's case, and he needed to see her. Immediately. The loaded silence that followed was heavier than any confession. For Sarah, the detective's call was a seismic event that fractured the carefully constructed piece of her quiet life. Hope, an emotion she had long ago buried under layers of ritual and resignation, was a violent and painful thing to feel again. Her first thought was that it was a prank, a cruel Halloween joke, but the detective's voice, heavy with a gravity that couldn't be faked, held her in place. After she hung up, she stood frozen in her living room, the receiver still clutched in her hand, the world tilting on its axis. The ghost of her mother, a presence she had learned to live with, suddenly felt terrifyingly close, as if about to step out from the shadows of the past and demand an accounting for the life Sarah had lived without her. The next morning, Havenwood's signature fog was a thick, oppressive blanket, muffling the world in a shroud of gray. Corbin drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind replaying Eleanor's terrified whispers. Beside him, Sarah was a statue of coiled tension, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if trying to pierce the veil of mist and see the answers waiting for them. The journey was almost entirely silent, the air in the car thick with unspoken questions and the shared heavy weight of their respective griefs. Corbin felt a fierce, paternal protectiveness toward this stranger, a woman whose life had been defined by the very mystery he was now poised to unravel. He was bringing her toward a truth that he feared might be more devastating than the long silence. Corbin had pulled what few strings he had left, calling in a single favor from the county's public works department. He met with a small, skeptical crew at the edge of the town, 2 men with a backhoe and a generator. He kept his explanation brief and vague, referring only to structural survey requirements related to the cold case. The foreman, a man whose face was a roadmap of cynicism, clearly didn't believe him, but shrugged, accepting the official paperwork as sufficient cause to waste a morning. Sarah watched the interaction from a distance, understanding that they were about to desecrate a place that was, for her, both a tombstone and a sacred ground. The mundane reality of the heavy machinery felt like a jarring intrusion on her private grief. Their arrival at the St. Jude's Foundation was a somber affair. The site seemed to resist them, the ancient pines standing like silent, disapproving sentinels. The air was still and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As the crew began unloading their equipment, the clang of metal against the oppressive silence felt like a violation. Corbin walked the perimeter with Sarah, pointing toward the overgrown northeast corner. "She said it was here," he said softly, the first word spoken between them in over an hour. Sarah simply nodded, her eyes scanning the cracked concrete, trying to reconcile the image of this desolate ruin with the warm, vibrant memories she held of her mother walking the hospital's polished halls. The first major obstacle presented itself almost immediately. The maintenance access tunnel Eleanor had described was not merely hidden, it was sealed. A slab of concrete, clearly poured long after 1977, blocked the entrance, likely a measure taken by the town council years ago to keep curious teenagers and ghost hunters out. The foreman spat on the ground, annoyance etched on his face. "This wasn't in the work order, Detective. This is demolition." Corbin met his gaze, his own expression unyielding. "Then your work order has been updated," he stated, the quiet authority in his voice leaving no room for argument. The delay was agonizing. Each minute the jackhammer spent pulverizing the concrete felt like an eternity to Sarah, stretching her fragile hope to its breaking point. As the deafening roar of the jackhammer echoed through the silent forest, Corbin found himself wrestling with a profound sense of dread. He was chasing the words of a ghost on a damaged tape, leading a grieving daughter on what could be a fool's errand. What if Eleanor had been delusional? What if the tape was a fabrication, or if her memory was flawed? He was gambling his last shreds of professional credibility, and far more importantly, Sarah Vance's heart, on this single, desperate clue. He watched her standing by a tree, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her own fragile form together, and the weight of his responsibility felt crushing. This was no longer about closing a case, it was about delivering a soul from limbo. Finally, with a groan of stressed rebar and a cloud of concrete dust, the seal was broken. A gaping black maw opened in the side of the foundation, exhaling a gust of stale, cold air that smelled of mildew and trapped time. It was the first breath the tunnel had taken in decades. The foreman grumbled about safety protocols, but Corbin, equipped with a heavy-duty flashlight, was already moving forward, his patience exhausted. He offered a hand to Sarah, but she shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I have to do this myself," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. She followed him into the darkness, stepping from the gray light of 2008 directly into the waiting silence of 1977. The tunnel was a cramped, claustrophobic space. The flashlight beams cut sharp, dancing cones through the thick darkness, revealing walls slick with moisture and floors littered with the debris of ages. The air was heavy and difficult to breathe. Every drip of water from the ceiling echoed like a footstep behind them, and the scuttling of unseen things in the corners set their nerves on edge. They moved slowly, methodically, following the curve of the foundation wall towards the northeast corner. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the noise of the machinery outside. Here in the belly of the vanished hospital, time itself seemed to have stopped, waiting for them to arrive. They found it exactly where Eleanor's voice had promised it would be, a massive, rust-eaten water pump, silent for 31 years. Behind it, Corbin ran his hand along the damp concrete blocks of the wall, his fingers searching for any imperfection. He felt it almost immediately, a slight give, a subtle shift that broke the pattern of the solid wall. "Here," he breathed, the word turning to vapor in the cold air. Using the edge of a crowbar, he carefully worked at the mortar, which crumbled away with surprising ease. With a final grating scrape, the block came loose. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, every fiber of her being focused on the dark, rectangular void that had just been revealed. Reaching into the cavity, Corbin's fingers closed around a small, heavy object wrapped in what felt like oilskin cloth. The package was cool and slightly damp, but remarkably well preserved against the ravages of time and moisture. He pulled it out into the beam of his flashlight, his own breath catching in his throat. This was it, the physical proof, the tangible link across 3 decades of silence. He turned to Sarah, her face a pale, luminous mask in the darkness, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and unbearable hope. Without a word, he gently placed the small, precious bundle into her trembling, outstretched hands. It was her discovery to make, her past to reclaim. With fingers that felt clumsy and numb, Sarah slowly and deliberately unwrapped the oilskin. The material was stiff and cracked with age, but it had done its job. Inside, nestled in the protective layers, were 2 items: a small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped by the damp, and a single photograph, its colors slightly faded, but its image heartbreakingly clear. It was a picture of her, aged about 7, grinning at the camera with a gap in her front teeth, her hair in pigtails. It was the very photograph she remembered her mother keeping on her bedside table. A choked sob escaped her lips, a sound of profound sorrow and overwhelming relief. Her mother hadn't forgotten. She had carried her daughter's smile with her to the very end. She opened the journal. The first page was not a diary entry, but a letter, the ink slightly blurred but the elegant, familiar cursive still perfectly legible. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then the world I knew is gone, and my greatest fear has come to pass. Do not believe what they will say about us. We were not saints, and this was not an ascension. It was an escape, born of a great and terrible lie. Dr. Finch promised us a world without pain, but he built it on a foundation of fear. I love you more than any paradise he could ever promise. I need you to know the truth of what happened here. I need you to know that my last real thought was of you." Corbin watched as Sarah sank to the floor of the tunnel, clutching the journal to her chest, her body racked with the kind of sobs that come from a place deeper than tears. It was a sound of 31 years of grief finally finding its voice. For him, the investigation had just been ripped wide open. This journal was not just a mother's farewell. It was a first-hand witness testimony from the heart of the conspiracy. It was the key that would unlock the final dark secrets of St. Jude's Asylum. The search for a missing person had ended, but the hunt for a monster, Dr. Alistair Finch, and the truth of his terrible, beautiful lie had just begun. Back in the sterile confines of Corbin's office, the world outside faded to an irrelevant murmur. The only reality was the small, leather-bound journal open on the desk between them, its pages yellowed and smelling of damp earth and trapped time. Sarah read aloud, her voice a fragile thread in the profound silence, weaving her mother's final days into existence Eleanor's elegant cursive described the escalating tension within St. Jude's, a place that had transformed from a sanctuary into a pressure cooker of fanatical belief. She wrote of Dr. Finch's nightly attunement sessions, which had become less like meditations and more like interrogations, where any flicker of doubt was publicly shamed as a symptom of the sickness. The promise of a painless world had become a threat. Ascend with us, or be left to rot in the decay. The narrative took a darker turn as Eleanor began to detail the truth of the chronically ill. Her penmanship grew shakier, the words more rushed, as she confessed the hospital's secret. Several of the patients were not patients at all. One was an investigative journalist who had checked himself in under a false identity to expose Finch. Another was a physicist from a local university who had initially consulted with Finch, only to become horrified by his reckless application of theoretical science and was subsequently committed against his will. Eleanor listed them by name, these inconvenient souls whose rational objections were silenced with sedatives and diagnoses of paranoia. They weren't being saved, they were being disposed of, their bodies hijacked for a journey they never agreed to take. Sarah's voice faltered as she reached the final entry, dated October 31st, 1977. Eleanor's writing was a frantic scrawl, detailing the activation of the resonance cascade. The hum she described was not peaceful. It was a violent, bone-jarring vibration that caused nosebleeds and disorientation. She wrote that the sedated patients were not sleeping peacefully, but were seizing in their beds, their bodies reacting to the unnatural frequencies tearing at the fabric of their reality. The idyllic ascension Finch had promised was a lie. This was not a gentle transition into a new state of being. It was a brutal, agonizing dissolution, a physical and psychic shredding of 81 human lives, and the staff's serene faith had shattered into screams of pure, primal terror. Then came the final horrifying revelation. As the walls of the sub-basement became translucent, Eleanor saw what lay on the other side. It was not the paradise Finch had described, not a world of pure energy and harmony. It was a chaotic, shrieking void, a maelstrom of violent color and deafening static, a non-place of pure entropy. She realized in that instant that Finch had no idea where they were going. His entire philosophy was a desperate gamble against the fear of death, a lie he told himself so convincingly that he dragged 80 others into the abyss with him. In her last lucid moment, Eleanor lunged for the machine's control panel, a final desperate act of maternal instinct to stop the process, to stay in the world her daughter inhabited. Her final scrawled words bled across the page. "He's afraid. It's all for nothing. Forgive me, Sarah." A profound, heavy silence descended upon the office, broken only by the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. The truth, in all its devastating clarity, hung in the air between them. Sarah slowly closed the journal, her hands trembling as she held the last testament of her mother's life. Eleanor Vance was not a follower. She was a victim who, in her final moments, had become a resistor. The 31 years of shame Sarah had carried, the quiet belief that her mother had willingly abandoned her for a cult, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a wave of fierce, heartbreaking pride. Her mother hadn't left her. She had died trying to get back to her. The catharsis was a quiet, internal earthquake, rearranging the entire landscape of her grief. Corbin watched the transformation on Sarah's face, the decades of pain giving way to a new, terrible understanding. He felt his own cynicism, the armor he had worn for so long, fall away completely. This was not a cold case anymore. It was a raw, open wound. He reached for the phone, his movements deliberate and filled with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He dialed his captain's direct line. "Sir," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I'm officially reclassifying the Havenwood vanishing. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a mass homicide. The perpetrator is Dr. Alistair Finch. I have the sworn testimony of a witness." He looked across the desk at Sarah, who was clutching her mother's journal, and knew he was finally doing the job he was meant to do. With the call finished, a fragile peace settled in the room. The gears of justice, rusted from 31 years of inactivity, had begun to turn. Sarah looked up at Corbin, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but for the first time they were not tears of confusion or abandonment. They were tears of resolution. "She tried to stop him," she whispered, the words a confirmation for herself as much as for him. The great mystery of what had happened was finally over, solved not by forensics or data, but by a mother's love that was strong enough to punch a hole through time. The chilling question of where the 81 souls had gone would linger forever, a permanent ghost in the town's memory. But tonight, one of them had finally come home. The news of the Havenwood vanishing's reclassification from a paranormal legend to a mass homicide case broke like a dam. The story exploded across national media. The eerie tale of a disappearing building suddenly grounded in the horrifyingly human narrative of a cult leader's final fatal act of manipulation. The town's kitschy ghost story identity curdled overnight. The gift shop T-shirts were pulled from the shelves, and the morbid tourist pilgrimages ceased, replaced by the somber presence of news vans and forensic teams conducting a respectful, if fruitless, survey of the site. For Havenwood, the truth was a painful cauterization of a wound they had learned to live with. The familiar ghost had been exorcised, but in its place stood the far more terrifying specter of Dr. Alistair Finch and the terrible calculated reality of his crimes. A week later, Sarah Vance stood at the edge of the foundation for what she knew would be the last time. The oppressive fog felt different now, no longer a shroud for an unknowable mystery, but a simple veil of weather over a known grave. This place was no longer a question mark that had defined her life. It was the final, silent testament to her mother's heroism. She knelt and placed a single white rose on the cold, moss-covered concrete, the vibrant bloom a stark contrast to the gray desolation. The 31 years of ambiguous grief, of wondering if she had been abandoned, had finally coalesced into a single clear emotion, a profound, heartbreaking pride. She was not the daughter of a woman who had left. She was the daughter of a woman who had died trying to come home. Detective Miles Corbin submitted his retirement papers 2 months ahead of schedule. On his final day, the office felt less like a mausoleum and more like a library of stories that had found their proper endings. As he packed the last of his personal effects into a cardboard box, his gaze fell upon the faded photograph of his wife and son. For years, the photo had been a monument to his own unresolved loss, a fixed point of pain. But helping Sarah find her mother had changed something deep within him. He no longer saw just the absence. He saw the fierce, enduring power of the love that created the memory. He placed the picture carefully in the box, not as a relic of a closed-off past, but as a compass for a future he finally felt ready to navigate. The official manhunt for Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who would be nearly 90 years old, was extensive but ultimately symbolic. No trace of him was ever found, and he was declared legally dead, presumed to have been the first victim of his own catastrophic device. His name, however, became infamous. His calm, persuasive voice, captured on the audio logs, became the subject of documentaries and psychological studies, a chilling case study in charismatic pathology, and the terrifying allure of a beautiful lie. He was no longer the forgotten director of a rural asylum, but a modern Icarus who, in his desperate flight from human suffering, had not flown too close to the sun, but had instead dragged 80 innocent souls with him into a self-made, inescapable darkness. Months turned into a quiet, peaceful year. Corbin, now a civilian with the easy posture of a man unburdened, often found himself on Sarah Vance's porch. They rarely spoke of the case that had bound their lives together. Instead, they discussed gardening, the changing seasons, and Corbin's largely unsuccessful attempts at fishing. In Sarah's home, the shrine to her mother had been respectfully integrated into a life that was now fully her own. New paintings she had started, full of bold, hopeful color, now hung on the walls. Their friendship was an unspoken epilogue, a quiet testament to the healing that can grow in the cracks of a shared tragedy, proving that closure was not about forgetting the past, but about finding a way to live peacefully alongside its ghosts. The foundation of St. Jude's Asylum remains, now a protected historical site and a memorial. The official story is one of mass murder at the hands of a deluded madman. Yet the fog still rolls in from the coast, clinging to the ancient pines, and a deep, unsettling ambiguity endures. The final, terrifying question of where they went is a void that no investigation can ever fill. Did the machine simply fail, vaporizing the building and everyone in it in a flash of failed physics? Or did it succeed in some unimaginable way, casting them into the chaotic, shrieking entropy Eleanor had witnessed? This unknowable fate is the true legacy of St. Jude's, a permanent, chilling reminder that the universe holds voids far deeper and more terrifying than an empty plot of land.